So, welcome back to another lesson on introducing Java programming. And up till this point, you've learned how to output stuff to a screen using Java commands. You've learned about how to keep track of information while your program is running. And the term for that was variables. And because Java is a typed language, every variable is going to have a particular type, and it has to have that type for the rest of your program. And so the way that looks, if we were writing a nice simple program here, is let's go back to the example we were using. Enter your age. That's an example of output to the console. And then we talked about variables. So if I wanted to represent the age, I could create it in this fashion. And this is the name that variable is going to have for the rest of the program. And it's only going to be able to hold integer information. It cannot hold decimal information. It cannot hold strings. It can only hold integers. The last thing we talked about was how I don't have to necessarily initialize it with a value, and most primitive data types will have some sort of default value. 0 for integers, 0.0 for doubles, etc. So the lesson today is about input. And input is actually a very complicated thing, because when you think about it, you could be getting input in your program from many different places and in many different ways. You can get input at the byte level. You can get input at the bit level. You can get input as characters, being typed from a keyboard. You could get input as a binary number that you want to represent as an integer or a real or a decimal number or something like that. And so there's many different ways of accessing it. Even then, there's a lot of subtler kind of programming specific differentiations that they have. And it turns out in Java that there's just dozens of ways of getting input. Even just from the keyboard, there's dozens of ways. And that can be very intimidating for a beginner programmer. And that's why we have this console class that was created to kind of make these types of things easier at the beginning. At some point, we're gonna have to kind of get down and dirty with Java, and we're gonna have to figure out some of these other ways. But for now, we're going to keep things nice and simple. And so you remember with the console, I can do C dot, and it will give me a list of all sorts of things that I might possibly want to do with it. And you'll see the print lines, and you'll see the prints, and then down here you're going to see these commands called read. And read literally means we are going to read a piece of information from the keyboard. And you'll see here that there's a number of things that I can read, and each one of these is associated with a particular data type. Because remember, an integer data type, an integer variable, can only hold an integer. So if I want to read an integer from the keyboard, I'm going to use a command called readInt. If I want to read an entire line of text typed in, I can use readLine. You'll notice that there's a read line that gives you a string, and then there's also a read string that gives you a string. So kind of what's the difference between those two? The read string will read a word up until the first space. That's what it's going to look at. You could type in 20 words, it's only going to read that first one. The next string will read the next one, and then the next read string will read the next one. Read line will read everything that you type in right up to that enter that you hit. And so that's a distinction between those. So let's do that. Let's do c.readInt. Now, you'll notice there's no errors, but you'll also notice that we have a bit of a problem, because this is gladly going to go to the console. It's going to wait till you type in a number and hit enter. And where does it go? Right? It'll happily do that. It will happily read in the number. It will take that number, that precious number that you've written, and it'll just toss it away. It's not going to store it anywhere. That's why we learned about variables. So if I want to store this information somewhere, I am going to have to store it in that variable that I created. And this is how I do it. I say read in that number and then store it into the variable age. That's what this line here is doing. And then later on in my program, I can say, I think you said your age was, right? Or I could manipulate that variable, and then I could output in 10 years you will be. Okay, so here's a nice simple program. My console comes up. You'll see the cursor is waiting. The program has literally stopped and is waiting for that input to come in. I can type in 12. It says, I think you said your age was 12. In 10 years, you will be 22. Nice, simple program. I could run this program again, and I could type in my age, and you will see that now I got an error. And that's because I told the program I wanted an integer. It read what I typed in. It tried to turn it into an integer, and it just gave up. It says, I don't know what you've done, but that is not an integer. So it is important. Remember, I'm going to keep coming back to this idea of a typed language, is that I am reading in an integer and storing it into an integer, and so the person has to type an integer. Now, when you start to write real programs for companies and later on in later grade 11 and grade 12 and things like that, you're going to have to actually do some error checking. You know, it's not right to just spit up errors at the user. You're going to have to kind of gracefully handle that and provide a little more help to the user. So you can have as many variables as you want. You can read in that information and throw it into age. I could read another integer and throw it into a new variable. I could read another integer and throw it into the exact same variable. Oops, the exact same variable. And what's going to happen is whatever was there before gets tossed out, and the new thing that's typed in gets put in. Tossed out, put in. Right? So if I want to keep track of two pieces of information, I'm going to need two variables. You're going to learn later that sometimes it's possible to use one variable to hold multiple pieces of information, but right now the rule is one variable, one piece of information. I'll give you one more example here. We are going to read in a name. Okay. So it's always nice to kind of, if you have a variable that's going to last for a while, it's nice to declare them at the top. So I'm going to say create a string with a name. I could make it blank at the beginning, but I don't need to, because I'm going to assign it a variable before. I'm going to assign it a value, sorry, before I use it. So I'm going to say name equals c dot. I know I want to read something. Do I want a line or do I want a string? Could a name possibly have two words in it? Yeah, kind of. So I think I'm going to go with read line. I always use read line by default anyways. And so now I can just print nice to meet you. What am I missing? There we go. So we run it. Enter your age, 30. It's waiting for another age because I added that extra piece in there. 35, and in perfect, now it's just waiting. I didn't put a prompt in there to tell me what I want to type, which is very bad, but for now I'm gonna type John Doe. Nice to meet you, John Doe. So that is the basics for how to get input, how to do simple arithmetic that you can do, adding and things like that, and then spitting output. And right away, just with these first 3 lessons, you now have a pretty broad range of things that you can do, programs that you can write. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do next, is to try a few programs to practice your ability to do these things. Hopefully that was helpful, give you a bit of information on how to input from the keyboard in a very basic fashion. And next we're going to move on to looking at more complicated processing that we can do with that. Take care. See you next time.